Good morning, everyone. Here we are once more. When I started these morning broadcasts last March, I thought it was like an emergency cycle that was going to run like a few weeks. We called it Shelter in Place. Then we gradually kept trying to find new names for it because things kept shifting. But now we're really in it for the long game. So we'll just keep going through the final exam and then we'll find something else interesting. I have to confess, I confess isn't perhaps not the right word, but I would like to say I've really enjoyed this. Far from being any kind of a burden or a pressure, the fact that I get up every morning and I get to talk to all of you, I hope you enjoy it. I know many of you write to me that you do, but I just love meeting you. I love meeting you all like this. There's a real sense of communion and community, which I'm deeply grateful for. It's not the result of my efforts, it's the result of your responses. Swami always said that the audience deserves much more credit than it usually gets in the way that we speak, because we don't speak from a curriculum script where we're repeating it every time, but we have conversations, and much of communication is thought transference rather than actual words. So I always feel like I've been in the company of my best friends. And I get to see you all every morning, even if your faces are not visible to me. It's a heart to heart. And I thank you for that. I thank you for your friendship and your attentiveness and your receptivity. So here we are again. So let's start with the prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, humbly we bow to you all. Dearest Swamiji, help us to be in tune with your presence, to act in such a way that everything we do will bring us closer to our own divine point of origin. Everything in this world is passing. The only lasting truth is our relationship with God. Awaken us. Bring us home to Thee. Om. Peace. Amen. Well, now, as we've been titling yesterday and today, and probably for a few more days, practical questions at the end of Swami's essay about all the different ways to extricate ourselves from the bonds of karma, he starts talking about, the actual process of people dying. And because I've been part of that experience for a half a dozen or more people in my life, I understand sort of what this cycle is about. And also, of course, having been called in for astral ascensions and to help people through this, I know there's a lot of very important questions that really need to be talked about. So we talked yesterday a lot about the Om vibration and the sound of the Om in the ear. Swami also talks about helping a person who's dying to bring their attention to the point between the eyebrows. And one way you can do it is to literally just put your finger on the forehead of a person who is close to passing and create a point of focus for them. It's not just a question of touch, because sometimes a person toward the end of their life can hardly feel their own body. But through your hands are a tremendous magnet, and through your concentration, you can help bring their attention to this point. The way Swamiji explains it, and this is how it's been said many times, we've talked about this, that the medulla is the sense of individuality, but identified with all the limitations of the body and all that that implies. And the spiritual eye is individuality, but identified with Christ consciousness. And from the esoteric point of view of the chakras, the medulla and the spiritual eye are the same chakra. They're just the positive and negative pole of that chakra. So we always have individuality. It just depends on whether we're oriented toward our limitations or oriented toward our infinity. And this whole cycle of the final exam has been at the moment when we separate from our physical body, which is the most compelling aspect of our identification with limitation. As the time comes when we have to let go of that, do we reach back and cling to it and cling to all the things associated with I am a separate entity acting on my own? Or do we reach upward to ourselves in attunement with spirit and realize even all those things that I seem to do as an individual were actually the divine just running through me? So this is the very sort of critical moment between limitation and freedom. So by helping the person to concentrate at this point, see what happens is as the energy begins to withdraw from the body, and this is, I'm going to go back up even a step. I mean, this is the big challenge in meditation itself. We are quite accustomed when we cut off all sensory input and try to still the thoughts. That's exactly the same process that we use when we fall into subconsciousness. And so that is a difficulty often for people when they meditate, is that when I cut off all that stimulation and try to calm my mind, I can be quite good at it, because what happens is I gradually lower my energy and go into a duller state rather than a more energized state. I mean, it's even we even actually literally fall asleep when we're meditating. People do. We joke about it. One of our main techniques is the Hong Saw technique when you're watching the breath. But there's an alternative called the Hong Snore technique, which sometimes people do. I mean, literally, every one of us has an embarrassing story. So I'm not really going to tell anybody else's embarrassing stories at this point, but these things do happen, or the sort of the falling off to the side kind of movement, because everything is very relaxed, but the energy is sinking. And in fact, one of the things that's very helpful when we're learning about meditation, it's a little confusing when you hear the phrase that super consciousness is on the horizon line. Let's see, how does it put out? But that superconscious and subconscious meet, and it's sort of like it's confusing. How could superconscious and subconscious meet? Because we tend to think of it as a linear progression. Subconscious, just one straight line. Subconscious, then there's conscious, then there's superconscious. So it feels to us like superconscious and subconscious are separated by this rajasic, outward-looking, active person, thing, place, like this. But the actual design of it, and I don't know where this came from. I don't think I invented it, but I heard it from somewhere. You think of a capital Y the way a child would draw it, with just an inverted triangle and a straight line at the bottom, just a real undecorated straight capital Y like that. Then lay it over on its side. So you have a straight line that then meets a triangle, the point of a triangle, and one angle of the triangle goes up and one angle of the triangle goes down. But all three lines converge at that particular point. The base, the horizontal base of that Y is our conscious level of awareness. And then conscious, subconscious, and superconscious. Subconscious is the angle of the triangle going down. Superconscious is the angle of the triangle going up. When we meditate, if you go to the base of this horizontal base of the Y, basically, when you meditate and when you go to sleep, you do the same thing, which is you roll up that line, so to speak. You just kind of start rolling it up like a bedroll, like sitting on a bedroll and rolling it up. You're no longer talking, you're no longer looking at things, you're no longer listening, you're no longer thinking, you're no longer moving. And we move all the way up so that the base is completely rolled up, and now I'm at the point of the triangle. If we're going to sleep, we just put out less and less and less energy, and then we fall into subconscious and we lose this world. Because I have an active mind, and in my later years I've developed a slight tendency toward insomnia. What happens is I get to that Y, I'm just beginning to think down, and then some kind of a bzzzt will come into my brain, and all of a sudden I'll be thinking. And it's like, oh no. I'm just like, here I am. suddenly I'm wide awake again, just because instead of energy decreasing, suddenly, bingo, energy came in. Alas, not super conscious energy, just conscious energy that makes me start scooting back down the base of the Y as if I were waking up. Then I have to do the whole thing over again. Now, when we're meditating and we come to that point, we have to increase our energy. And there's a habit of decreasing our energy at that point. But what we have to do is we have to intensify our energy. But you see, the confusion is we all understand what it is to put out energy, but it's usually physical or mental, or even emotional, you might say. Physical or mental or emotional, but emotional in in a downward pulling way. Excuse me, let me just put something in my throat. Physical in a downward pulling way with memories or feelings or things that draw us back into the conscious world. Okay? So when you get to that point, you have to put out more energy to rise, but we have to learn how to put out energy that is not emotional, that is not mental, and that is not physical. And that's why it's hard. And we'll find also, and this is why also the position of the eyes is helpful. Because if you keep your eyes upraised, with closed eyes, I'm talking meditation now, closed eyes with eyes above the horizon line, concentrating on the spiritual eye, that is counter to going into subconsciousness. And that's one of the ways we keep ourselves from going into subconsciousness. If you watch yourself when you're meditating, whenever your mind has begun to drift, your eyes have also begun to fall. And if you simply physically raise your eyes to be looking out across the horizon above the horizon line, it will wake you up, because you can't do both things at the same time. So when we die, we're dealing with exactly the same reality, except the rollback from the physical, mental, sense-oriented way of doing things is a final rolling up. And I'd mentioned earlier how sometimes you can literally watch the life force come up the spine in a person, except this time, as it vacates the chakras, it's not going back. I'm talking at the very end of a person's life. They're just the life force, the body, we animate the body, inhabit the body from the center out in the womb. That's how it's developed. And so we retrace that. We withdraw from the edges. We go back to the center. We come back up the spine. We come to the origin point, which is the medulla. But the real origin point is the Christ center. And as Swami puts it, at that point, most people sink back. I mean, so you can just see it even physically. Not everyone dies lying on their back. But however you want to say it, we're at that same juncture again. And most people sink back. They just let go. But the yogi wants to consciously rise up. And depending on how aware we are, and I don't just mean whether we're in a coma or not, whether we're like that, but how inwardly aware we are, how much of a habit we have developed. People who meditate have a great advantage when it comes to dying. In Nalini's book, Transitions with Grace, which is 20 or 25 stories, more than that, I think it's about 25 stories of yogis dying, or people who are closely associated with yogis, who are influenced by yogis when they're dying. And one of the advertisements for that book says, much has been written about the benefits of yoga for life, for living your life, but not much has been written about the benefits of yoga for dying, for ending your life. Because if you've been practicing yoga and meditation, when you reach that juncture, you know how to put out energy. You know what to do. Master put it in another absolutely charming way. He said, people who think that life is only material and that consciousness emanates from the brain, that the brain is the source of consciousness, rather than the transmitting station for consciousness. Consciousness already exists, the brain transmits it, which is why, for example, if a person's brain is damaged and their mental faculties are not up to what is considered to be the necessary standard for interacting in this world, or in other ways are physically impaired, there's nothing wrong with their consciousness. As soon as they get out of that brain, they have a full consciousness. It's just the transmitting station was damaged for one reason or another. So at death, you're not blind, you're not deaf, you're not mentally impaired, because your consciousness was always fine, just the brain broke. So Master says, those who think that the brain is the source of consciousness, when they feel the brain dying, and I love how Master puts it, they feel obligated to go unconscious because they just don't even know that you can be conscious without a brain. So when they feel their brain going, they just go unconscious because no other option is available to them. People, if they're truly entirely materialistic, so Master said, they never wake up in the astral world. He said it's restful. It's kind of a gray dream, is how he put it. And only when they're back in a physical body do they begin to wake up again, because now they have a brain and they can be conscious. Now a yogi knows that a brain is incidental to consciousness, and a deeply meditating yogi knows that I don't need a brain at all. In fact, a brain is actually a limiting factor to my consciousness. And therefore, as the brain begins to die, the yogi can go upward and just separate himself from the brain without losing his awareness. In fact, when Tushti, a friend of ours who was a yogi for many years, died in Oregon, where she was living at the time, Portland, she lived many weeks longer than the hospice nurse, who had, of course, a great deal of experience with dying people, many weeks longer than the hospice nurse thought was possible. And she just proposed a theory, which none of us could verify or deny, that because she had been a serious meditator, she was more familiar with out-of-body states. And so the hospice nurse speculated. By this time, unfortunately, Tushti was not communicating, because during those last weeks, she withdrew so completely, she didn't communicate. She said, most people, when they get that far out of their body, just assume they can't come back. But a yogi knows that they can come back, because she went very far away many times and then would just come back. And we all would just thought, certainly, this is her final goodbye. But then she'd take this deep diaphragmatic breath and then come all the way back. And for a while, she would just come all the way back to, outward consciousness, conversation, just completely herself. Then slowly she stopped doing that. But it was quite interesting, and awakened us to many possibilities. So, of course, if you can be completely awake, and one of the questions that's asked here, which is an important question, many people are in a great deal of pain, especially if you're depending on what's taking your life. You can be in a great deal of pain. The typical medical response to that is to give you painkillers, which may also dull your awareness. And people get very conflicted, not knowing what to do. Now, Swamiji says, of course, the more conscious you can be, the better it is. At the same time, and this I have observed, and the hospice nurse even said that. She said, too much pain can actually keep you longer in your body, because it's just it's too intense. And too much pain can also distract you from any other reality except that pain, and that might not be the best state of mind to pass away. Now, I'm just saying this because Swami's answer to the question was very simple. Well, the less sedated you are, the better. And I want to make it very clear that that was his entire answer. So what I'm going to tell you is my practical observation and my practical experience, which is, I think most people simply need the pain medication. There's no way around it. And I also know that the only thing that's being sedated is your physical body. Your soul is not being sedated, because the drug is just a physical thing and your spirit is completely separate from that. So I know, and I know even Paula, who died more consciously well, as consciously as anyone I know of. Swami remarked about that. You can't leave as consciously as she did without being exceedingly highly advanced. He even said, she may have been liberated, is the words he used, because you can't die that consciously. She was really steady on morphine. She had a real solid dose of morphine. She never went into a coma with the morphine, but a coma is something that has lots of different reasons. It's not like the morphine itself won't put you in a coma. I'm speaking up beyond my portfolio when I say that. But I know she was heavily medicated and looked forward to her medication, meaning that, she needed that medication, but therefore then she was able to be conscious. Others that I've seen who've been heavily medicated, like Tushti as an example, were completely withdrawn, but I don't think it was necessarily because of the morphine. It was just because she was. People are just different. So I'm going to add another point on this, which is just, again, this is my practical observation. I don't think what we do makes a lot of difference at that point. I think the soul has its destiny and is going to exit in the way that it's going to exit. It's going to do what it's going to do. It's a lot like birth. I've been involved also when babies were born, and parents will have all kinds of plans, especially when there's a home birth and you have a lot of control. Or nowadays you can go into the hospital and still have a lot of control. Who's going to be there, what the music is going to be, how this is going to happen, just sort of all these different ideas. Time after time, I've seen all those plans just go to pieces. And whoever's there is who's ever meant to be there. Whoever misses it is the ones who are meant to miss it. It was supposed to happen on Wednesday, but it happens on Friday afternoon or Monday morning. It's just like we're not in charge. There's a point at which what the ego wants, it can play around with what it wants. But there's a force that's much greater than us. And my observation of people's passing is that we can make all the plans we want. I say this to people. Take the chemo, don't take the chemo. Take the morphine, don't take the morphine. Invite people to be there, ask no one to be there. Just do whatever makes sense to you. And I believe in the end it doesn't make a whit of difference, because the soul is in charge and it's just simply going to do what it's going to do. And we'll do the right thing. In other words, you can't make a mistake. It's beyond human error. Just something so important will just happen as it's meant to happen. It's also true in the same way with death. People sometimes feel really awful because, I was with my mother, every day for 2 weeks, and then I just went out to make a phone call. And while I was out of the room, she died. I had just left the hospital, and by the time I got home, I got the call that my father had died. It happens really often, surprisingly often, too often, for it to be just an accident or a result of the lack of our intention. So let's think about this. There you are. You haven't left your mother's bedside in 2 weeks because you're so devoted to her. You think she's not devoted to you in the same time, in the same way? Do you think it's easy for her to leave when you're sitting there loving her like that? Now, I don't mean that that's a bad thing for you to do, but very often they just need the moment when you've stepped out of the room, because that's the time that they can just walk away. Swami Kriyananda talked about it with Anandamui Ma, which of course was even deeper because she was a saint. But Swami he was visiting her in India. He had a lecture program to keep. He had to go get on a train, I believe. He had to be somewhere else. He had to go get on a train. It was getting time for the train to leave. He had to leave. Ma was standing on the porch of the ashram saying goodbye to him. Swami finally said to her, "Ma, I can't leave while you're standing there. I just can't leave." So she laughed, and then she went inside, and then he was able to leave. The first time that I was sitting with someone who was dying was this woman named Julia. And, well, that whole story was also interesting in itself. We have a school here in Palo Alto, and Palo Alto is an extremely intellectual area, and everybody's very worried. And our schools have been going for almost 50 years now. So we have generations of children, and we know that our method works beautifully for creating strong, integrated, intelligent, capable adults in wonderful ways. But we're not conventional. We're not, according to the present convention, which I could say a lot about it, but I won't. I'll just leave it. I was the admissions director of our school at that time. It was the first 7 years. Julia comes with her darling little Emma. Emma's about 4 years old, maybe 5. Julia feels that Emma should be in our school, but she also has a conventional educational concept, and she just doesn't know what to do intuitively. She knows Emma belongs with us, and literally, she collapses with her arms around me, sobs on my shoulder, that if she follows her mother's intuition and puts Julia into our kindergarten, she's afraid it will hurt Emma's chances of getting into Harvard. And I had to, of course, take it seriously because it was a real thing for Julia. Okay, yes, it'll be all right. Don't worry, it'll be all right. So she does. A year or 2 years after Emma enters our school, Julia develops a brain cancer. And what actually happens is that we, Ananda, had to take that family through Julia's death, literally. And we had to help Emma through that grieving process. And all I can say is thank God she was with us. Just thank God. I mean, they were slightly active in Ananda, but it wasn't a deep connection on that level, but it was a deep connection spiritually and personally. So when Julia finally had a seizure and went into the hospital and was on the breathing tube and all of that, her husband called us, me and a few of us, and asked us to just come to the hospital because it was the end. So we sat there with Julia. She's on the breathing tube. We're sitting there with her on either side. I mean, there's about 5 or 6 of us there. And none of us knew Julia really well, but we all knew her. So we're there with her husband. We're just talking. Finally, it occurred to one of us, said to the husband, if you know she's going to die, perhaps you should take the breathing tube out. So he took the breathing tube out, but she lived about maybe 8 or 9 more hours, to everyone's surprise, because for most of that time her husband was sitting next to her. And he stayed and he stayed and he stayed, and he just, we all kept expecting her to stop breathing. The doctors didn't know how she could be breathing. Finally, her husband just said, she'll never die as long as I'm here. He said, so I'm going home. And he just said goodbye to her and walked out. And then he just left her with us. And so we were there for another, I don't know, hour maybe, and she was just breathing strong. So it had been a long time. So we went downstairs because we were hungry. We'd been there for a long time. We were just sitting down to have something to eat when all of a sudden this incredibly urgent call to go back upstairs, inward call. Nothing happened externally. We just knew we needed to get back to her room. We got back to her room, and her breathing had shifted from, this doesn't always happen, but it often happens, from tremendous effort to breathe, and then a little exhalation, then another tremendous effort to inhale, and a little exhalation. And if you're listening, and I've seen this multiple times, all of a sudden it'll shift, and there's very small effort to breathe in, a very great effort to breathe out. If you're doing a vigil, as soon as you hear that, you're very, very close. My father went that way. My sister had just gone home. She lived a mile away. All of a sudden, my father shifted like that. I just got her on the phone. I said, get back here. We don't have much time. She came back, and he was gone within half an hour. So we rushed upstairs, and Julia was there. And it's just, we ommed, we did everything that Swami said to do. And she just left this world. But her husband was right. So it's not a failure. The soul is in charge. It knows what it's doing. And I'll talk a little bit more tomorrow, and the next day and the next probably, about other parts of this. Trust God. Trust the super consciousness of yourself and everyone around you. Be in the presence of the light. That's what this whole experience is for, is to bring us into the light. God bless you, my friends.